The golden age of piracy has officially returned. Launching today, Assassin's Creed Black Flag Resynced brings Edward Kenway's beloved Caribbean adventure into the modern era. This game is far from a simple remaster. Ubisoft has completely rebuilt the 2013 classic using the latest Anvil game engine. Players can now enjoy heavily updated character models, overhauled environments, and modern graphical features like Raytracing, all of which make navigating the high seas more breathtaking and demanding than ever before. And to find out just how demanding, I've spent countless hours testing as many GPU configurations as my sanity would allow before going all Jack Sparrow. Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by ASUS and their new Neo motherboard lineup, including the Tough Gaming X870 Pro Wi-Fi 7 Neo, ROG Strix B850 Gaming Neo, and ROG Strix X870 EA Gaming Neo. Built for AMD's AM5 platform, the Neo range has been refreshed with upgraded power delivery to ensure maximum stability for the latest Ryzen processors. ASUS has also improved the building experience with their easy PC do-it-yourself features, including PCIe Q release, which allows you to remove your graphics card quickly without fighting with the retention clip. The Neo series also includes enhanced AI networking features, intelligent CPU cooling optimization, and redesigned memory pathways to improve signal quality, helping users to get more out of their high-speed DDR5 memory. So whether you're putting together a new system or upgrading your platform, learn more about the ASUS Neo motherboard range via the link in the video description. Okay, so with sweeping visual enhancements comes a renewed tax on PC hardware. While the tropical storms, dense jungles, and bustling pirate havens are stunningly immersive, achieving smooth frame rates requires the right firepower under the hood. Now, upgrading the jackdaw is one thing, but making sure your PC is ready for the voyage is another. So to speedrun that process, I've tested 50 different graphics cards. Utilizing Black Flag Resynced's built-in benchmark tool, we've gathered exhaustive performance data across multiple resolutions and quality presets to see how several generations of PC hardware handles the updated engine. Whether you're sailing on a budget GPU or looking to push a flagship card to its absolute limits, this comprehensive benchmark breakdown will show you exactly where your system stands. Now, as I noted earlier, the game does support ray tracing, offering both hardware and software-based solutions, meaning when enabling non-RT cards, you can still simulate advanced lighting to a degree, and there are two quality settings. The standard option enables ray-traced global illumination, and this replaces the original baked lighting with real-time, pre-computed diffuse indirect lighting to eliminate light bleed and create realistic shadowing. Then the highest level of ray tracing is labelled as extended, and this also enables ray-traced reflections, which simulates accurate indirect specular lighting, replacing traditional screen-space reflections. The game also features support for upscaling and frame generation. For NVIDIA GPUs, there's DLSS 4.5 and DLSS frame generation / multi-frame generation. For AMD GPUs, there's FSR 4.1/ML upscaling and FSR frame generation. And then for Intel GPUs, XeSS 3 and XeSS frame generation. As for the game, there's loads of modern rendering technologies, such as micro-polygon / virtual geometry, physical-based rendering, advanced shaders, a dynamic weather system, and modernized water rendering, which I have to say looks incredibly good. The ocean's been completely rebuilt with advanced foam simulation, improved light scattering, and reworked water physics to make sailing the jackdaw feel dynamic. Anyway, there's a lot of data to go over, so best we get into it. Starting with some preset scaling data comparing the Radeon RX 9070 XT and GeForce RTX 5070 Ti at 1440p, we see when using the ultra-high preset with ray tracing enabled, with the game maxed out, the Radeon GPU was 6% faster, and when we downgraded the level of ray tracing with the standard mode, that margin increased to 9%. Then, once we disabled ray tracing entirely, the 9070 XT enjoyed a 10% win over the 5070 Ti. We're also looking at a 25% increase with RT disabled compared to fully enabled for the 9070 XT, and a 20% increase for the GeForce GPU. Both GPUs saw a further 10% performance increase when downgrading the quality mode from ultra high to very high, and then just 6% when going from very high down to high. Then from high to medium, we're looking at a further 11 to 13% increase, while the low preset only offers a small 4% increase. Then from low to very low, we gain an additional 9% performance, and from very low to ultra low, that provided a further 10% performance. So the game does scale very well. Now here's a quick look at upscaling at 1440p. The quality mode offers a 28 to 30% performance increase, while balanced boosted the 5070 Ti by 45%, and the 9070 XT received a much larger 54% increase. That said though, the performance mode doesn't really seem to do anything for either model, as the frame rates remained much the same. This could be a result of using different models for the various quality modes, or it could just be a bug that needs to be addressed. I'm not quite sure at this point in time. For this set of results, we're using the ultra high preset along with the maximum ray tracing quality mode, which is labeled as extended. And we're testing at the native resolution, starting with 1080p. Here the RTX 5090 was able to render 119 FPS, making it 25% faster than the RTX 4090, which unexpectedly was just a few percent faster than the 7900 XTX. In fact, the previous generation Radeon flagship GPU performed well above expectation, beating the RTX 5080 and 9070 XT. Now, despite using ray tracing, this game clearly favors Radeon GPUs, and we're seeing this with a number of the matchups. Not just that, but Nvidia's latest generation Blackwell GPUs don't really perform noticeably better than the previous generation Ada Lovelace GPUs. The RTX 5080, for example, was just 5% faster than the RTX 4080. We're also seeing a situation where the standard RX 9070 is a few frames faster than the RTX 5070 Ti, making it a massive 23% faster than the RTX 5070. In fact, the RTX 5070 was only able to edge out the previous generation 7800 XT, which is a very strange result. Now, dropping below 60 FPS, we find the RTX 3090, which only matched the RTX 4070 and 7700 XT. The current generation 9060 XT 16GB was a massive 27% faster than the 8GB version, strongly indicating that for these quality settings you very much require more than 8GB of VRAM. The 9060 XT did also beat the 5060 Ti by a 6% margin, while the 8GB versions were bottlenecked by VRAM to around the same level of performance. This was also true for other 8GB GPUs. For example, the 8GB 5060 Ti and 5060 delivered similar performance, and in fact they weren't much faster than the typically much slower 7600 XT. Beyond that, we are dropping down to frame rates in the 30s, and at that point I'd suggest lowering the quality settings in search of better performance. Finally, I should note that for this testing, the 5700 XT would be using software-based ray tracing, so this isn't an apples-to-apples comparison, as the visual quality likely won't be as good, but this isn't something that I've had time to investigate yet. I just thought it was worth pointing out. Stepping up to 1440p, as you'd expect, the strain on the GPUs increases significantly, yet the Radeon favorability remains a defining characteristic of this title. The RTX 5090 averaged 102 FPS, making it roughly 23% faster than the RTX 4090 at 83 FPS. Meanwhile, the 7900 XTX continues to overperform, rendering 72 FPS, which allowed the last generation Radeon flagship to completely outpace Nvidia's newer RTX 5080. The 9070 XT is also hot on their heels with 68 FPS, edging past both the RTX 4080 Super and the standard RTX 4080. We also see that the mid-range Blackwell cards struggle to show a meaningful generational uplift here. We also find the RTX 5070 Ti managing 64 FPS, but the standard RTX 5070 fell way behind at 52 FPS, and that means the 5070 Ti was 23% faster than its sibling. The standard RTX 5070 only barely slides past the previous generation 7800 XT. The 8GB VRAM bottleneck becomes a huge problem at 1440p. We see this with the 9060 XT and 5060 Ti. For example, the 9060 XT 16GB delivered 40 FPS, while the 8GB model dropped down to 33 FPS, and this provided the higher VRAM model with a 21% performance advantage. Meanwhile, the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB managed 39 FPS, whereas the 8GB version dropped down to 34 FPS. Not as big of a difference there, but still, the 16GB model was clearly faster. Now, in an interesting twist, the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB managed to match the newer RTX 5060 Ti 8GB, clearly demonstrating that the extra VRAM can entirely erase a generational architectural advantage under these extreme settings. Now, below 40 FPS, the mid to low tier cards began dropping into the 30s and 20s, and therefore you will require to reduce the quality settings for a smoother experience. Moving up to the extreme 4K resolution, we see that having to render over 8 million pixels combined with the extended ray tracing setting results in a situation where basically nothing can render the game at a satisfactory level. Here the RTX 5090 stands alone as the only GPU capable of breaking the 60 FPS barrier, rendering an average of 71 FPS to make it roughly 34% faster than the RTX 4090, which managed 53 FPS. Below that we see another unexpected situation where the RTX 5080 and 7900 XTX somehow find themselves deadlocked at 45 FPS. Blackwell's gen-on-gen improvements are also remarkably slim at this resolution. The RTX 5080, for example, only cleared the older RTX 4080 by a mere 5 FPS margin. Now further down our graph, we see a situation where the 9070 XT managed 42 FPS, barely edging past the 5070 Ti, and RTX 4080 Super, both delivered 41 FPS, but that's clearly a very good result for the Radeon GPU. Meanwhile, the standard RTX 5070 rendered a modest 32 FPS, matching the 9070 GRE, and finding itself just 2 frames ahead of the legacy RTX 3090. The 8GB VRAM issue that we observed at the lower resolution turns into an absolute brick wall at 4K. The 16GB version of the RTX 5060 Ti carved out a 20% lead over its 8GB sibling, while the 16GB model of the RX 9060 XT pulled roughly 15% ahead of the 8GB variant. More tellingly, a massive choke point forms around 20 FPS. Of course, this is a very low frame rate, but this is also where the 8GB models of the 5060 Ti, 4060 Ti, and 9060 XT are all bottlenecked to the exact same level of performance, and this saw them failing to outpace older mid-range hardware like the RTX 3070. Below this point, the chart completely collapses into unplayable territory, with budget cards like the RX 6600 and RTX 3050 dragging performance down into single-digit slideshows. Obviously, native 4K with maximum ray tracing is going to be extremely demanding, and you will require a top-tier flagship GPU for highly playable performance, and even then many of you will want to look at enabling upscaling. Now we're going to go over the ultra-high ray tracing extended data again, but this time with upscaling enabled. DLSS for the GeForce GPUs and FSR for the Radeon and Arc GPUs. Starting with the 1080p quality upscaling, the RTX 5090 leads with 135 FPS, making it 17% faster than the RTX 4090, but below that things get incredibly cramped. The 9070 XTX, for example, punches well above its weight once again with 113 FPS, and that made it faster than the RTX 5080, which only managed 99 FPS. Now, despite using upscaling, VRAM still plays a massive role here. The 16GB version of the 9060 XT, for example, ended up being 27% faster than the 8GB version, showing that even with upscaling at a low resolution like 1080p, maximum ray tracing settings will severely penalize the smaller frame buffers. Still, even with quality upscaling enabled, if you're after 60 FPS or better, you will require an RTX 3080, 9060 XT 16GB, 6800 XT, 7700 XT, or RTX 4070. Moving up to 1440p using the balanced upscaling preset, we see a nearly identical performance profile to that of the 1080p data because the internal render resolution remains much the same and manageable for these cards. The RTX 5090 remains dominant at 136 FPS, while the RTX 4090 and 7900 XTX are locked in a neck-and-neck battle at 116 and 115 FPS respectively. Then we see that the RTX 5080 is only able to match the average frame rate of the RX 9070 at 100 FPS, and only outperformed the previous generation RTX 4080 Super by a meager 3%. Lower down the stack, the 8GB memory limits continue to sting. The 16GB 9060 XT, for example, held a commanding 29% performance advantage over the 8GB version, and the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB comfortably edged out its 8GB counterpart. If you're running a mid-range 8GB card at this tier, upscaling keeps you at around 40 to 50 FPS, but you are clearly fighting a hardware constraint. Finally, at 4K using balanced upscaling, the RTX 5090 stretches its legs to hit 126 FPS, making it 20% faster than the RTX 4090, which averaged 105 FPS. The 7900 XTX puts on another incredible showing at 91 FPS, successfully defending its lead over the RTX 5080, which managed 88 FPS. At this heavy resolution, the mid-range cards show a severe performance divide based entirely on their memory capacity. For example, the RX 9060 XT 16GB rendered 49 FPS, leaving the 8GB model far behind at 39 FPS, and that's a massive 25% performance penalty due entirely to a lack of VRAM. The story repeats with the RTX 5060 Ti, whereas the 16GB card manages 53 FPS, the 8GB variant sinks down to 44 FPS. Overall, upscaling proves to be a massive lifesaver for 4K gaming in this title, transforming what was an absolute slideshow on native settings into a playable experience, especially for the upper tier hardware, even if many of the budget 8GB cards are still left struggling in the low 20s and 30s. Now for this testing, we're using the ultra high preset with the ray tracing mode completely turned off, and we'll start with the native 1080p data. Here the RTX 5090 was able to render 144 FPS, making it 18% faster than the RTX 4090, which produced just an 8% lead over the 7900 XTX. In fact, the previous generation Radeon flagship GPU still performed exceptionally well, beating out both the current gen 9070 XT and RTX 5080, which only managed 101 FPS. And we also see that with ray tracing disabled, the game further favors Radeon GPUs, and we're seeing this with a number of the matchups. And not just that, but Nvidia's latest generation Blackwell GPUs continue to show very conservative generational gains over the previous generation Ada Lovelace GPUs. For example, the RTX 5080 was just 10% faster than the RTX 4080. We also see that the standard RX 9070 was a few frames faster than the RTX 5070 Ti, making it a massive 21% faster than the RTX 5070. In fact, the RTX 5070 was only able to tie the older generation 6950 XT and barely edged out the 7800 XT, further highlighting the architectural advantage for AMD in this title. Dropping further down the stack, we see that turning off ray tracing has relieved some of the heavy VRAM pressure, but not completely. The 16GB RTX 5060 Ti was roughly 9% faster than the 8GB version, and interestingly, the 8GB 5060 Ti actually suffered a generational regression, tying with the older 8GB 4060 Ti due to the VRAM constraints. Beyond that, we are dropping down to frame rates in the low 30s and 20s, and at that point, I would suggest lowering the quality settings or enabling upscaling in search of better performance. Stepping up to 1440p, again with ray tracing disabled, we see that the RTX 5090 delivers an impressive 123 FPS, providing a massive 24% performance leap over the RTX 4090. The 7900 XTX held up well once again with 92 FPS, continuing to flex its muscles over Nvidia's newer RTX 5080, which only mustered 82 FPS. In fact, AMD's newer mid-range part, the 9070 XT, also joins the party with 85 FPS to outpace the 5080 by 3 frames per second. The RTX 5080 barely managed an 8% lead over the older, vanilla RTX 4080, which managed 76 FPS on average. The mid-tier Blackwell lineup also faces a tough crowd as the standard 9070 slices through with 80 FPS to beat out the RTX 5070 Ti. And this saw a massive 27% performance delta over the standard RTX 5070, which rendered just 63 FPS. So this places the 5070 in a bit of a tight spot, being outmatched by the previous generation 6950 XT at 67 FPS and barely remaining ahead of the older mid-range 7800 XT. Even with ray tracing completely turned off though, at 1440p using the ultra high quality textures, it just proves too much for the 8GB memory configuration. The 16GB version of the 9060 XT, for example, managed to average 51 FPS, leaving the 8GB variant trailing behind at 43 FPS, and that made the higher capacity model almost 20% faster. And we see an almost identical story play out with the RTX 5060 Ti, whereas the 16GB version manages 48 FPS, the 8GB variant dropped down to 41 FPS, matching older hardware like the RTX 2080 Ti. Further down the graph, the numbers rapidly sink beneath 30 FPS, where cards like the RX 6600 and older hardware begin to really crawl, and this would require gamers to retreat to a lower quality preset or lean on upscaling. Now, at 4K, the RTX 5090 was good for 88 FPS, which was a massive 31% increase over the RTX 4090, which averaged 67 FPS. Then we see that the red team continues to show a massive advantage in this game engine, as the previous generation flagship 7900 XTX punches all the way to 61 FPS, completely overshadowing the newer and much more expensive RTX 5080, which averaged just 56 FPS. Nvidia's newest architecture continues to look remarkably stagnant in this title, with the RTX 5080 only managing to beat out the older RTX 4080 by a trivial 10% margin. And we see a similar rough showing for the mid-range Blackwell cards as the standard RX 9070 match the more expensive RTX 5070 Ti at 52 FPS, which in turn placed it a staggering 27% ahead of the standard RTX 5070. And the standard RTX 5070 also struggles here, again losing out to much older, admittedly high-end parts, but very old, like the 6950 XT. We also see that even with ray tracing disabled, having just an 8GB frame buffer is a massive liability. The 16GB variant of the RTX 5060 Ti displays this perfectly, rendering 32 FPS to outpace its 8GB version by an enormous 23% margin. In fact, a brutal wall hits right at 26 FPS, flatlining the 8GB models of the 5060 Ti and the base 5060 to a dead tie, and here they fail to separate themselves from legacy cards like the RTX 2080 Ti. Below that, the numbers plummet into unplayable slideshows. The entry-level silicon like the RX 6600 or RTX 3050 are unable to even clear the 15 FPS mark. Now, for this set of data, we're using the high preset with ray tracing completely turned off, and we're testing at the native resolution, and we'll start with 1080p. Here, the RTX 5090 was able to render 170 FPS, making it 20% faster than the RTX 4090, which, as we've come to expect in this title, meant that it was just 3% faster than the 7900 XTX. In fact, the previous generation Radeon flagship GPU performed so exceptionally well under these settings, it hammered the RTX 5080 by a 15% margin, which is insane to see. And again, Nvidia's latest generation Blackwell GPUs, they just don't perform noticeably better than the previous Ada Lovelace hardware in this title. The RTX 5080, for example, was only able to match the older RTX 4080 at 120 FPS. We also see that the standard RX 9070 was a few frames quicker than the RTX 5070 Ti, making it a massive 23% faster than the RTX 5070. In a very strange twist, the RTX 5070 was actually beaten by the previous generation 7800 XT, which averaged 96 FPS. And looking further down the stack, dropping the preset to high completely eliminates the VRAM bottlenecks that we observed using the ultra-high settings. The current generation 9060 XT 16GB delivered identical performance to the 8GB version with 80 FPS, strongly indicating that for these quality settings you no longer require more than 8GB of VRAM. And this perfect equalization was also true for the RTX 5060 Ti, where both the 16 and 8GB models tied perfectly with 76 FPS. Beyond that, we are dropping down into the 40s and 30s, and again at that point I would suggest lowering the quality settings further in search of better performance. Upping the resolution to 1440p, we see that the RTX 5090 was able to render 144 FPS, making it 20% faster than the RTX 4090, which was just 7% faster than the 7900 XTX. Once again, the previous generation Radeon flagship GPU performed exceptionally well, beating out the new RTX 5080, which only managed 100 FPS. We also see that the standard RX 9070 was a few frames quicker than the RTX 5070 Ti, making it a massive 25% faster than the RTX 5070. In fact, the RTX 5070 was barely able to edge out the previous generation 7800 XT and RTX 4070 Super, both of which tied at 76 FPS. Further down the stack, the 16GB and 8GB models of the 9060 XT and 5060 Ti performed identically at 62 FPS and 57 FPS respectively, proving again that the high preset completely removes any VRAM bottlenecks at 1440p. We also see an interesting battle in the mid-range where the current generation RTX 5060 at 51 FPS was only 4% faster than the older RTX 3070. Most surprisingly, a dead heat three-way tie formed at 41 FPS between the RTX 4060, the legacy RX 5700 XT, and Intel's Arc B570. Beyond that though, we are dropping down into the 30s and 20s, and once again at that point, I would just suggest lowering the quality settings for better performance. Finally, at 4K, the RTX 5090 was able to render 103 FPS, making it 32% faster than the RTX 4090, which maintained an 8% lead over the 7900 XTX. That meant the old Radeon flagship was still faster than the RTX 5080, which only managed 68 FPS, making the XTX 6% faster. We're also seeing that the standard RX 9070 was able to render 61 FPS, and that made it slightly faster than both the RTX 4080 Super and RTX 5070 Ti. We also see that the RTX 5070 was matched by the older 7900 GRE at 50 FPS, and both were edged out by the legacy 6950 XT, which rendered 51 FPS. Moving down the stack, we find the aging RTX 3090 perfectly tied with the 6800 XT at 44 FPS. Then, even further down, we find an incredible four-way dead heat forms at exactly 38 FPS between the 8GB and 16GB variants of the RX 9060 XT, RX 7700 XT, and the older RX 6800. Finally, it's worth noting that the RTX 2080 Ti is still holding on, matching the current generation RTX 5060 and 16GB RTX 4060 Ti at 32 FPS. Beyond this cluster though, performance quickly deteriorates into the 20s and teens, meaning upscaling is absolutely mandatory for the bottom half of our chart. Assassin's Creed Black Flag Resynced is a great looking game that I don't think relies heavily on nostalgia, though I get for some of you that will be a major factor. Apart from the massive visual overhaul though, there are a number of elements that have been added, updated, or enhanced. As for how it performs on PC, for those hoping to play it maxed out with all the RT bells and whistles enabled, if you're okay with enabling upscaling, which I feel you should be, then it's not too bad. At 1440p with balanced upscaling enabled, you're looking at around 60 FPS with an 8GB 5060 Ti, 16GB 4060 Ti or RX 6800, and for over 60 FPS, the 9060 XT 16GB will do nicely. Previous generation GPUs such as the RTX 4070 or 7700 XT provided a really smooth experience, but for those seeking a high refresh rate experience, you will need top tier hardware, I'm afraid. I should note that all of this testing was conducted using the latest AMD and Nvidia drivers, and I don't necessarily believe that the GeForce performance will be improved with a future driver, as this performance really is in line with what we saw from Assassin's Creed Shadows, for example. It just seems as though the Radeon GPUs tend to perform much better in titles using the Anvil game engine. Even so, it was impressive to see just how well the previous generation Radeon GPUs performed, with parts like the 7900 XTX consistently outpacing the RTX 5080. The 9070 series also looked amazing, and again, we often saw the 9070 XT matching and even beating the much more expensive RTX 5080. As it currently stands, the RX 9070 costs about as much as an RTX 5070, and in this title it was often over 20% faster. I was also shocked by how well the old Radeon RX 5700 XT performed. Using the high quality preset at 1080p, it was good for 53 FPS on average, making it an insane 47% faster than the RTX 2060. Basically, the RTX 2060 was unusable at these quality settings, averaging just 36 FPS with 1% lows of 30 FPS, which is technically playable, but it was a horrible experience when compared to what we got with the 5700 XT. Of course, you can lower quality settings further, and we found when going from high to medium, that could boost performance by 15%, which would get the RTX 2060 just over 40 FPS, and then the 5700 XT up over 60 FPS. Anyway, Tim will have some optimizations for you shortly, which hopefully will help improve the game's visuals without a massive performance hit. So make sure you are subscribed for that. It will be on the channel in the next day or so. And that is going to do it for this initial look at GPU performance in Assassin's Creed Black Flag Resynced. I hope you enjoyed the content, And above all else, I hope it was useful for working out where your system will be or what upgrades you might need to do in order to achieve the levels of performance you're after. Anyway, as I said, that is going to do it for this one. If you like the video, then hit the subscribe button. No, do the like if you liked it, of course. Subscribe if you want Tim's optimization guide, which you absolutely do want. And if you want to support the channel more directly, we have the join button or Patreon. Sign up to either one of those things will give you access to our monthly live streams, our Discord server, behind the scenes content, and Q&A stuff. So check that out if you're interested. If not, it's perfectly fine. And of course, I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.